They say history is written by victors, but there are nights when history itself whispers back. And when it does, it never tells the same story twice. Welcome back to the Unveiled Scroll. And if you value stories that peel away the polished surface of the past to reveal what was buried beneath, remember to like, subscribe, and share, because tonight I am opening a chapter that was never meant to be read aloud. A chronicle known only as the Forbidden Archive. And this is the story of how one kingdom did not fall by war or plague, but by the slow, deliberate unraveling of its own soul. Long before its disappearance from maps and memory, the kingdom of Valenrook stood at the edge of the known world, a realm praised by travelers for its disciplined order, its towering libraries, and its rulers who claimed that knowledge itself was the highest form of virtue. Valenrook did not conquer with armies alone. It conquered with records, with surveys, with ink and parchment, believing that to name a thing was to control it, and to record a life was to give it meaning. At the center of the capital rose the Grand Archivum, a vast stone complex whose halls were said to stretch longer than the city's walls, guarded day and night by scholars sworn to silence men and women who wore their vows like chains beneath their robes. Among them was Elias Vorn, a junior archivist whose name appears only once in surviving fragments, yet whose choices would come to echo louder than kings. Elias was not born into power, nor brilliance, but into obedience, trained from childhood to believe that truth was something fragile, dangerous, and only safe when locked away. Each morning he descended into the lower stacks where dust lay like snowfall upon forgotten shelves cataloging census rolls trial. Transcripts and confessions extracted under the authority of the crown, and each night he returned home with the quiet certainty that some truths once seen could never be unseen. The Forbidden Archive was rumored long before it was named a sealed wing beneath the Archivum, accessible only by a council decree its existence. Denied in public records, yet reinforced by the thick iron doors Elias passed each day without being allowed to touch. Older archivists spoke of it only in glances and unfinished sentences, warning that what lay below was not forbidden because it was false, but because it was complete. Valenrook's rulers believed that chaos began where uncertainty remained, so they commissioned a project unlike any before it, an attempt to record not only events, but intentions, doubts, and private thoughts collected through interrogations, informants, and quietly mandated journals that every citizen was required to keep. Officially, these journals were said to strengthen self-reflection and civic harmony, but in truth, they fed a machine that consumed the inner lives of the people and reduced them to patterns, predictions, and risk scores. Elias first sensed something was wrong when he was ordered to reclassify a set of documents marked simply as corrections. A harmless label that concealed records of citizens who had vanished without trial, their lost written thoughts preserved with clinical precision, their final doubts annotated in red ink by unseen hands. The language was calm, almost tender, yet it described the erasure of human beings as if adjusting numbers on a ledger. And as Elias compared the entries, he felt a tightening in his chest, the creeping realization that the archive was not preserving memory, but replacing it. His internal conflict grew as he noticed the same phrases repeating across unrelated lives, identical fears, identical regrets, suggesting that the journals were no longer reflections but rehearsals, that people were being taught what to think, then punished for thinking it too. Sincerely or not, sincerely enough. Late one evening, while returning a misfiled folio, Elias discovered a narrow stair concealed behind a movable shelf, its steps worn smooth by use despite the supposed secrecy of the lower levels. Against every rule he had sworn to uphold, he descended, driven not by rebellion, but by a desperate need to understand what kind of truth required such darkness to survive. At the bottom he found a chamber lit by oil lamps and lined with volumes bound in black leather, each marked with a sigil he recognized from royal decrees, the seal of absolute authority. These were not histories, they were forecasts, documents detailing projected unrest, moral deviation curves, and recommended removals years before the events themselves were said to have occurred. Elias realized with horror that the kingdom was no longer reacting to its people, but scripting them, shaping reality to match its records, then citing the records as proof that it had been right all along. In that moment, the archivist understood that Valenrook's greatest fear was not rebellion, but unpredictability, and that the Forbidden Archive existed to eliminate surprise at any cost. He also understood that by reading these pages, he had crossed a line that could never be erased, because once you see how a future is written, you can no longer pretend it arrives by chance. As the lamps flickered and the silence pressed in, Elias faced a choice that would define not only his fate, but the fate of a kingdom that believed itself eternal, unaware that its obsession with control had already set the terms of its own silent, irreversible doom. What Elias Vorn held in his hands that night was not merely forbidden knowledge, but a mirror held too close to the face of power. And as he returned the black-bound volumes to their shelves, his steps echoed with a new weight, the sound of a man who had learned that truth, once systematized, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. From that moment forward, Valenrook no longer appeared to him as a kingdom of order, but as a living organism devouring its own future to preserve the illusion of stability in the present. Days passed, and Elias resumed his duties with a precision that alarmed even himself, for outward obedience had become his camouflage, yet inwardly every record he touched now seemed to pulse with hidden intent. He noticed how new decrees from the crown arrived already justified by archival citations, how laws were passed, citing disturbances that had not yet occurred, and how arrests followed projections written years prior, as if the archive itself were pulling invisible strings that guided judges, soldiers, and citizens alike. The people of Valenrook sensed this tightening noose without understanding its shape, feeling watched even in solitude, editing their own thoughts before committing them to mandated journals, until language itself grew cautious and repetitive, stripped of imagination and risk. Elias's inner conflict deepened into torment, for he believed in knowledge, yet could no longer deny that knowledge without mercy becomes tyranny in its purest form. A prison built not of stone, but of certainty. His chance to act arrived quietly, as all turning points do, when he was assigned to assist Senior Curator Mar, a man revered for his longevity and rumored to have served under 3 successive rulers without ever aging in spirit or doubt. Malrek spoke softly, his voice like dry parchment, and he explained that the archive was never meant to be hidden forever, only until the people were ready to accept that freedom was inefficient, that peace required guidance, and that guidance required sacrifice. As Malrek spoke, Elias realized the true horror, that the architects of the Forbidden Archive did not see themselves as villains, but as custodians of an optimized humanity, trimming away excess emotion, dissent, and unpredictability like diseased branches from a tree. When Elias questioned whether a life reduced to a data point could still be called a life, Malrek answered with unsettling calm that a life unmeasured was already lost. That night, Elias returned to the hidden stair, not as a curious observer, but as a man preparing for treason, and he began copying fragments of the Forbidden Archive, selecting not the forecasts of unrest, but the annotations that revealed how decisions were manipulated to fulfill those forecasts. His plan was fragile and desperate, to seed doubt among the people by exposing that their future had been written without their consent, believing that once they understood the mechanism, they might reclaim the chaos that made them human. Yet even as he worked, Elias sensed that the archive was aware of him, not as a sentient being, but as a statistical anomaly, a deviation that would soon be corrected. Whispers followed him through the halls, subtle changes in his assignment's guards lingering a moment too long at his desk, and edits appearing in documents he had not yet touched, as if the future were adjusting itself around his resistance. The kingdom's obsession with foresight had created a paradox, for by attempting to control every outcome, it had become incapable of responding when something truly unexpected emerged. And Elias felt himself becoming that unexpected variable, both terrified and resolved. In private moments, he wondered whether exposing the truth would save Valenrook, or simply hasten its collapse. But he also understood that silence had already chosen the latter. As he sealed the Copit pages and hid them among innocuous census rolls, Elias accepted that his own fate was no longer his to decide that once a system defines destiny. Defiance is measured not by survival, but by the clarity of one's final choice, and somewhere deep within the Forbidden Archive, new entries were already being written, calmly documenting the necessary removal of an archivist who had learned too much. The removal of Elias Vorn did not arrive with chains or accusations, but with a summons written in the same neutral hand that had catalogued births and deaths for generations. And as he walked through the grand archivum for the last time, he understood with bitter clarity that the most efficient forms of control never announced themselves as punishment. He was escorted not to a dungeon, but to a chamber of evaluation, where robed officials reviewed his life as if it were a completed manuscript, citing passages of loyalty alongside footnotes of deviation, weighing his worth with scales calibrated long before he was born. Elias spoke little, for he realized that confession was unnecessary in a system that already believed it knew him better than he knew himself. And when the verdict was delivered, it was framed not as a sentence, but as a correction, a recalibration meant to restore harmony. Officially, Elias Vorn was reassigned to a remote archival outpost, his name quietly removed from central records, his absence explained as administrative. Rutina and the kingdom moved on with the relief of a body convinced the infection had been contained. Yet what Valenrook did not account for was that Elias had already acted that fragments of the Forbidden Archive had begun to circulate in disguised form, hidden within approved texts, marginal notes, and seemingly innocuous sermons delivered by scholars who trusted the written word more than royal proclamations. At first, the effect was subtle, a flicker of unease as citizens noticed discrepancies between predicted events and lived reality. Moments when the script faltered and people glimpsed the machinery behind the curtain. Questions emerged in whispers, then in careful conversations, as individuals realized that their private doubts were not isolated failures, but shared responses to a system that had been shaping them all along. The rulers of Valenrook responded as they always had by consulting the archive tightening controls, issuing new mandates designed to restore statistical normalcy, unaware that their own reactions were now being anticipated and undermined by the very logic they had enforced. The Forbidden Archive began to collapse under its own weight, for its predictions relied on a population that behaved as expected, and once expectation itself became suspect, the models unraveled, producing contradictions that no amount of annotation could resolve. Civil order did not shatter in riots or open rebellion, but in something far more dangerous to an authoritarian mind: hesitation, the collective pause of a society no longer certain that obedience equaled safety. Elias, in exile, sensed this shift through rare messages smuggled to him, coded reports of officials arguing over conflicting forecasts, of guards hesitating before making arrests that the archive insisted were necessary, of judges delaying rulings because the future they had been promised no longer aligned with the present unfolding before them. His internal struggle did not ease with distance, for he carried the weight of knowing that every doubt he inspired also carried risk that instability could claim lives as surely as tyranny, yet he believed that a fragile freedom was more honest than a perfected cage. In the capital, the Grand Archivum became a set of quiet panic scholars working through the night to reconcile data that refused to converge, discovering too late that a system designed to eliminate uncertainty had no language for acknowledging error. The more the kingdom relied on the archive to restore control, the more it exposed its own dependence, until governance itself seemed waiting for predictions that no longer arrived with confidence. In this vacuum, local authorities began making independent decisions, fragmenting power in ways the central models had never anticipated. And Valenrook's famed order gave way to a patchwork of improvised responses, each deviation further eroding the authority of the archive. Elias understood then that the true collapse of a system begins not when it is attacked, but when it is revealed, when its inner workings are no longer mythic or unquestionable, but visible, flawed, and human in their fear. As the months passed, reports of shortages, delayed edict, and unresolved disputes multiplied, not because resources were gone, but because certainty was, and a kingdom built on foresight alone had no instinct for adaptation. The silent doom of Valenrook was no longer a distant prophecy bound in black leather, but a living process unfolding in real time. Its end, not marked by fire or conquest, but by the slow evaporation of belief in a future that could be perfectly known. By the time the rulers of Valenrook recognized that their greatest creation had become their greatest liability, it was already too late to reverse what knowledge, without humility, had set in motion. The Forbidden Archive, once the sacred engine of governance, stood increasingly unused, its projections dismissed as unreliable, its authority eroded by the very exposure meant to free the people from its grasp. In a final attempt to restore control, the council ordered the archive sealed, entirely declaring a return to tradition and human judgment. But this gesture only confirmed what citizens had already learned, that the kingdom had been guided not by wisdom but by fear of uncertainty. Without the archive's omnipresent guidance, officials accustomed to scripted decisions faltered, revealing how deeply dependence had replaced discernment, and Valenrook's administration fractured under the strain of autonomy it had long denied itself. Elias Vorn did not live to see the end, for records suggest he died in quiet obscurity, His final days marked not by recognition, but by a measured peace, knowing that he had reintroduced doubt into a world that had mistaken certainty for virtue. Years later, travelers would pass through the region once known as Valenrook, and find no ruins, no dramatic remnants of catastrophe. Only scattered settlements that spoke of the kingdom as a cautionary legend. A place that collapsed inward, consumed by its own desire to know too much. The Grand Archivum itself was dismantled stone by stone, its volumes dispersed, destroyed, or left to decay, as if the land itself wished to forget the weight of a future once imposed upon it. And yet, fragments endured, references in marginalia, half-remembered phrases warning that the moment a society believes it can fully predict its people, it has already begun to lose them. As I close today's scroll, remember that history's darkest chapters are not always written in blood, but in ink, in policies justified by numbers, in systems that promise safety at the cost of the unknown. Thank you for listening here on the Unveiled Scroll. And if this story stirred something in you, explore our other videos where forgotten histories and hidden truths await, because the past is never as silent as we are taught to believe, and sometimes its quietest warnings are the ones we most need to hear.